Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, the second of our double bill today. And we take a brief break from the events of 1944 to go back in time to 2 years earlier and the pivotal air battle for the Solomons. John Bruning returns to World War II TV to talk about his new book, 53 Days on Starvation Island. And I'll bring him in now. So, good morning where you are, John. How are you today?
Hey, Paul, I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. So, one of the things, the perennial kind of subjects historians have is are some of the subjects being tackled the ones that have been tackled before? It's Market Garden, it's Midway, and Guadalcanal has been covered, quite a bit in the past. What drew you to bring it to the subject again, and why do you think this story needed being told?
Well, I'll tell you what, this started really in General Marion Carl's living room in 1991. I was working on my original master's thesis topic, which was on naval aviation training prior to World War II and how effective it was in the first 8 months of the war. And Marion Carl lived about 60 miles from the University of Oregon. So I sent him a letter, and asked if I could interview him. And he he rolled the bones with me and invited me to his house.
Wow.
Like, I was a grad student at the University of Oregon. Didn't have a great reputation among veterans in the area because the U of O is kind of known for being anti-war. They burned the ROTC building down in the 70s. So he took a real chance on me, and I drove down in my 56 Ford with a mullet and showed up on his doorstep. And we spent the day talking about his training experience and growing up in Oregon, and then went through his experiences in the Solomons, starting with Guadalcanal and then his subsequent deployment. And I walked out of that a changed person. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life after that, which was oral history. So he was the first, and I ended up, I think, interviewing about 1,500 veterans altogether over the course of the next 2 decades. And flash forward to 2010, I was involved in a helicopter mishap in Afghanistan. It started to catch fire.
That's not good.
No. We ended up on the ground in the middle of nowhere in the Hindu Kush, and the only flat ground anywhere was a dry lake bed. And as I was wandering around photographing the Polish infantry that was supporting us, those guys, we were carrying them to a remote COP. And I made a list of books that I wanted to write before I died if I got back. And so it became my bucket list. And number 1 was Indestructible. Number 2 was Race of Aces. Mm-hmm. Number 3 was I wanted to write about Marion Carl. And I started this, and actually, as I was going out the door, I had a little bit of a moment at Kandahar when I looked over and saw a VMFA 232 F-18 taking off. And that was Dick Mangrum's squadron. VMSB 232 was the first dive bomber unit onto Guadalcanal in August. And I saw that. I'm like, okay, you need to do something about Guadalcanal, John. This is a sign. So flash forward to 2020, I started working on this book about Marion Carl, and I realized that there was an entirely untapped story inside the whole Guadalcanal narrative. And that was the story of the Marine aviators who were in the first 2 squadrons that went to Guadalcanal. Now, there have been books written about the Cactus Air Force, but they cover a much broader time period. I wanted to take a look at these 2 squadrons because they were so pivotal in what happened over the course of the 53 days they were on the island. And so that's the genesis of the book. And that's where I tried to place it within the greater historiography of Guadalcanal.
No, thank you very much for that. And in looking at the PDF that publishers sent me, is that we all often as historians use those turning points, pivotal moments. This is the defining moment of this campaign. And sometimes we use that term a little bit, we sprinkle it around on every action, but this one really kind of fulfills all the criteria of being a pivotal action, isn't it? This is well before the streamlined aviation of 1944, 45, when the US Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force has kind of got things right, and the same applies to British and the Commonwealth. But 42 is really, it's a steep learning curve. Things aren't going well globally, and you're thrown in at the deepest end of the deep end. It is really, really seat of the pants stuff, isn't it, at that time?
Oh, very true. And the thing that blew my mind when I started delving into who the guys were in these two squadrons was the fact that most of them had minimal training at best. Some of them hadn't even been in the cockpit of a combat aircraft before they got to the squadrons in July of 42. And they literally had about 3 weeks to get up a very steep learning curve. And the skippers of the two units, Richard Mangrum and John L. Smith, realized that in order to prepare for this deployment, they were going to need to just focus on a couple of tasks. There was no way they could train them to be tactically proficient in 3 weeks, which is really all they had before they ended up boarding the USS Long Island and heading south for combat.
Wow. So as we said, and you said in your introduction, it's about interviewing the survivors, the oral histories, and it's all about the people. Your books are primarily about the people and the situations they find themselves in. So you've sent me photos, things. We'll bring them up on the screen, and then you can tell me about these people. We'll do tales until we run out of time, basically. So I'm looking forward so much to hear about these guys, because they're, it's a cliche, but you couldn't make these guys up. Everyone could be the subject of a blockbuster movie. Of extraordinary, aren't they?
They really are, especially John L., who's on the screen. So John L. Smith was a University of Oklahoma graduate. He was in the ROTC program. He was not a very social, personable person at Oklahoma. He wasn't involved in any of the normal activities that you would see guys who are in ROTC they were in. I actually ended up getting his yearbooks from the 4 years he was at the school. And he graduated from the ROTC program, and several of the guys that he went through with ended up on Guadalcanal with him, incidentally, in Marine infantry units. He originally was assigned, he went into the Marine Corps, and he was originally assigned to an artillery outfit. And he did that for a couple of years and then earned a slot to flight school at a time when there were less than 50 fighter pilots in the Marine Corps, if you can imagine that.
Wow.
50. And overall, I think there were less than 200 altogether in the Corps by this point when he joins. And he originally became a dive bomber pilot. So he flew in a dive bomber squadron until 41, and then he joined VMF 221 and went out on the Saratoga right at the start of the war and ended up on Midway with Marion Carl and Floyd Parks and all of the guys that ended up fighting at the Battle of Midway. But prior to Midway, he got pulled back to Hawaii and was given command of VMF 223, which was a command in name only. It was just a stub of a squadron. It was a couple of crew chiefs, a couple of typists that he actually had to swap and barter for so that he had somebody who could actually type. And they had just a couple of Brewster Buffaloes and 3 pilots. That was the sum total of his squadron until he and Dick Mangrum got called to the Air Wing Commander's office in early July. And they were told, you're going to be filled out. You're going to get a full complement of pilots and planes, and you have to be ready for combat in the South Pacific in a month. Okay, which would be great, except the pilots that they got had been rushed through the training pipeline. So virtually none of them had gone through what they called advanced carrier training group, which was at San Diego, where that was supposed to be the spot everybody learned to fly Wildcats, Dauntlesses, whatever combat aircraft they were going into. And they were supposed to get some carrier qualification time, all of that. None of that happened for the majority of these pilots. A couple of them went through, but most did not. And at best, the ones that went through, they didn't get the full syllabus. They only got 4, 5, 6 hours. So when this rush of replacement pilots came in, John L. had all of these kids who essentially a year before had been in fraternities all around the country, partying in college. And now they're Marines in uniform. They didn't go through the basic school like most Marines. You know, they were kind of Marines in name only, and just wearing the uniform. They had joined the Naval Aviation Cadet Program, and because they were top 10% in their class, they had the option to go into the Marine Corps aviation units. So that's how they kind of backdoored their way into the Marine Corps back then, and they didn't know the ropes. They didn't know the things that officers were supposed to do in a squadron, assigned duties like engineering officer, armaments officer. John L. and his colonel of extremely experienced leadership, which included Rivers Morrell, who was a Naval Academy grad from the 30s and had been flying for years, and Marion Carl, who had just come back from Midway. These guys, these three pilots and officers had to basically make the entire squadron into Marines and combat pilots in a month.
Wow.
So
and they're going to go into a situation where there's no time to gradually phase in. Before we go back to the people again, remind us of the situation in the Solomons in the summer of 42. I mean, it's on a knife edge, isn't it?
It's mind-blowing how seat of the pants everything was, because the U.S. had just won the Battle of Midway, right? The Kido Butai had taken a severe blow, lost 4 of its aircraft carriers. So the Japanese Navy was reeling from that defeat. However, the strategic initiative had not been wrested away from the Japanese yet. And that's actually what happens at Guadalcanal. The Japanese look around and they're trying to decide how they can continue to remain on the offensive against the Allies. And they decide they're going to use the Solomon Islands as the shaft of a spear that will drive deep into the heart of the communication lines, the sea lanes between the U.S. West Coast and Australia. And the first step would be to build a long-range bomber base for G4 Betty bombers at Guadalcanal, and then launch amphibious assaults into the New Hebrides, which are to the south and southeast of Guadalcanal. And the idea being get more islands with air bases so they could interdict the sea lanes. Well, the Pentagon, the War Department saw this happening. They saw the photo recon imagery that the B-17 squadrons were producing from Guadalcanal. They realized what the Japanese were up to and saw it as an intolerable threat that could basically topple the strategic equation in the Pacific and make pretty much all the plans that we had in the works obsolete. So the decision was made to launch America's first offensive of World War II to retake Guadalcanal and seize that airfield that the Japanese were building. And they hastily threw together an invasion force that included Australian vessels, and they achieved complete surprise on August 7th, 1942. They'd actually speeded up the operation, which made it even more seat of the pants, because I think they moved up the landing date by a week or so. The rehearsal before they actually landed was a complete cluster. So once they got on the island, though, and they actually executed the landing, it went pretty well. And the 1st Marine Division lands. They get ashore on Guadalcanal and on the islands around Tulagi, which was the anchorage across Savo Sound. They seize the airfield in the first day. There's tough fighting for the islands around Tulagi. That takes a couple of days, but those islands are eventually secured. And now the Marines have a foothold in the Southern Solomons, and the shaft is reversed. So this is now, if we can hold it, Guadalcanal becomes the stepping stone up the Solomons and a direct threat to the main Japanese base in the area, which was Rabaul, about 600 miles away. So if whoever ends up holding Guadalcanal has a strategic hinge. And the Japanese realize this, and they launch a series of counteroffensives that convinces, after a tremendous naval defeat, in fact, the worst in American history, the night after the landing, called the Battle of Savo Island, or Savo, we lose four cruisers, one of which was Australian, and over 1,000 sailors. And that defeat convinces Admiral Fletcher, who was in command of the aircraft carriers, to withdraw. And by doing that, he denudes Richmond Kelly Turner's transport force of its air cover. So they withdraw, and they leave the Marines on the island with 3 days worth of ammunition and barely any food. They end up having to survive on captured stocks of Japanese rice and canned goods that they find around the airfield. And that's actually what sustains the Marine aviators who come in a couple of weeks later when the airfield is finished. And it's also the reason why, I mean, like, the term Starvation Island was a Japanese term. It was a nickname for the island. But what people don't really know is that the Marines starved too. Like these guys like John L. Smith. I mean, you look at that photo, he's trim, fit guy, right? These guys lost 30% of their body weight while flying in combat off of Henderson Field. And they did so while being sniped on the ground, machine gunned on the ground. They were in constant danger of the airfield being overrun. They were shelled. They were bombed. They had naval bombardment attacks at night. They were denied sleep by these raiders that they called washing machine Charlies. That would come over and just randomly drop bombs to keep everybody awake. So it was a tremendously difficult, probably the most difficult deployment any American aviator has ever experienced. And the only thing that held this unit together was John L. and his leadership.
And that, to continue your tip of the spear analogy, the issue the Allies are facing generally in 42 is the shaft of the spear is a little bit wobbly and broken and not quite finished yet, and not enough of it. But by 44, 45, the spear is a solid steel shaft. In fact, it's multiple shafts up behind the spear point. But at this point, it's all a bit ragged, and that's no offense to anybody. It's just the situation it was. The Allies are playing catch up still in production, in tactics, in just numeric numbers of everything.
They were short of everything on Guadalcanal, and what was being sent to Guadalcanal a lot of times didn't actually arrive. So they have this situation in early September or late August when a ship comes in that's supposed to have all of their ground gear for the dive bomber squadron that Richard Mangrum commanded, and also John L. Smith's unit. So things like you don't even think about. Bomb trucks, for example, or bomb carts. They didn't have any bomb carts. So to load bombs on the SBDs, you had to do that by hand. And they're doing this in the mud and the rain or dust and insane levels of heat. I mean, this is, no easy feat. They had no fuel trucks. So they were refueling the aircraft by hand with 55-gallon drums of gas. A lot of times they were using captured Japanese gas, which was a lower octane and made the American engines run rough, but that's all they had. And, it's like you think of a military operation and you don't think that one piece of cloth could derail everything in terms of the air support for that operation. But it actually happened at Guadalcanal. The fuel was so polluted by, just junk in these cans of, or these drums of fuel, that they had to filter the fuel through chamois. And there was one guy who thought that through, just on his own, grabbed some chamois before he went up to Guadalcanal. And if he hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been flying.
Wow.
It's just remarkable. The number of things that go into keeping two squadrons running, and they had none of it. I mean, when they originally arrived, they didn't even have tools to maintain their aircraft. Eventually, they got 2 tool sets, and they were working with those. But 2 tool sets, and you've got 19 planes in John L's squadron and 12 in Dick Mangrum's. I mean, you're talking a lot of airplanes and not enough tools to go around.
Wow.
So they had to make really hard decisions. Like in the dive bomber unit, the synchronizing gear for the 50 caliber machine guns that sat over the cowling of the SBD, they had all sorts of oil leaks or some sort of problem with the synchronizing gear that was very fussy and very tricky, and they didn't have the tools or the manpower or the time to fix those. So gradually over the course of the next 3 weeks when they first arrived, almost all the SBDs ended up with non-functioning forward-firing guns.
It's hard to really take on board just how perilous and how fraught this was. I mean, as a Brit, of course, I mean, I'm justly proud of the British air effort in 1940 in the Battle of Britain, but it has to be remembered that it was part of a huge air defense plan that involved radar and supply systems and observer corps and all the backup that were able to be there to give those fighter pilots and the bomber command the edge to take on the Luftwaffe. But here there is really, as you've been saying, a sense of you are absolutely on your own and you haven't even got enough to do the job, and yet you've got to do the job. So extraordinary stuff. Let's plow on through some of the photos and talk about some of these amazing characters, because I'm enthralled.
So this is Marion Carl. Marion Carl was born in Hubbard, Oregon. He was a dairy farmer's son. His dad died early in his life. He lost a brother also. A very, very rugged Depression era life, and he escaped it by going to Oregon State. And after he finished up at Oregon State, he joined the Marine Corps and became one of the 50 fighter pilots in the Corps in 1939. And Marion goes on to a career in aviation and in the Marine Corps that really has no peer. I've heard him called many times the Chuck Yeager of the Marine Corps because he set so many records. He set altitude records. He was the first Marine to fly a helicopter, first to land a jet on an aircraft carrier. I mean, I think he was the first man to break Mach 2. He had an extraordinary career, and he retired as a major general. In 1942, he was a young lieutenant, suddenly promoted to captain just before the Battle of Midway, and he flew with 221 at Midway, which was completely wiped out. And talking to him in 1991 about that day, he was still very bitter over the leadership failure in the aftermath, because they launched to stop the Japanese air attack on Midway. And they had 25 aircraft. Most of them were Brewster Buffaloes. There were, I think, 6 F-4F Wildcats involved in the battle, and Marion happened to be flying one of the Wildcats. And in about an hour of combat overall, of the 25 pilots in his unit, the CO and 14 men were casualties. And one of them came back and he was wounded, but they lost 14 KIA. Of the remaining aircraft that got on the ground, there were only 2 that were flyable. The others were just shot up wrecks, and Marion's was one of the 2. And there's a story that I read about in the prologue of the book that underscores Marion Carl's character and personality. The senior surviving officer, after that mission and after the Japanese raid, turned the squadron over to its first sergeant and said, "You're in charge." And he went into a dugout with a couple of his buddies in the squadron who had survived and got drunk. Basically, for the next 3 or 4 days, he was just completely inebriated. Later that afternoon, they got word there was an incoming raid. They had 2 operational airplanes, and they were up against what they thought at the time was another 100 Japanese planes inbound. And Marion just climbed into his Wildcat and went airborne with another one of the guys from the squadron. I'm like, doesn't matter the odds in his mind. Doesn't matter the fact that the rest of the squadron has just emotionally collapsed. He's there to fight, and he's there to do his duty. And that really came to symbolize the kind of man he was, not just that day, but consistently through his entire career. This was a guy who later flew combat as a brigadier general in Vietnam when he took the 1st Marine Brigade into Vietnam in the 60s.
Wow. I mean, crazy. I mean, and we've got a question just quickly about, the situation these flyers are in. James Murphy is saying, were the Japanese aware at that time of their severe shortcomings? Did the Japanese know how few aircraft there left, and they were held together with sealing wax and string? And are they that aware, or do they think they're up against a more a slicker outfit in a sense?
I think Japanese intelligence. That's a great question, by the way, James. Yeah, that's a great question. They knew that there were aircraft the very day they arrived. The Japanese troops around the perimeter reported them landing and had a pretty good idea of the numbers. I don't think they had any idea of how austere the airfield was, and the lack of maintenance, the lack of ground crew for the first couple of days. All of that, I think, eluded the Japanese. But one thing that played in the U.S.'s favor through all of this was the Japanese consistently underestimated how many troops were actually on the island. So until later on in the campaign, they really didn't try to devote the actual numbers they needed to overwhelm the Marines. And by that point, they had been reinforced with the 7th Marine Regiment and again with the 164th. So there were some U.S. Army troops on the island as well. But that said, I think the pivotal moment at Guadalcanal on the ground comes in September with the Battle of Bloody Ridge. I think that was probably Japan's best chance to retake the airfield. We can talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, they didn't really understand who they were or how austere the situation was. And they certainly didn't understand the skill disparity between the Marines and the Japanese. Because if you look at who was flying out of Rabaul for the Japanese, these were guys in some cases had been flying combat back in the early 30s during the Shanghai incident. Some of them had been, the leadership had been flying since 37 and flying in combat. Like this is like they're flying in combat while most of the Marines are still playing on their JV football teams back home in the States. So the leadership and the combat experience organic to the squadrons that the Marines were facing, I mean, they couldn't compete with that.
Wow, amazing stuff. Well, more photos, more stories. Let's keep going.
So that's John L. Smith. The first part of the book, I wanted to show what America looked like in November of 1942 when the guys came home from Guadalcanal, and they were among the first combat veterans to return from combat at this point of the war for the United States. You just didn't see this. In fact, I think I called one of the chapters "The First Heroes Home" because they became the Marine Corps' first big press junket, and that set the stage for all the other war bond tours and things like that. And this photo was taken during that in November of 1942 at Naval Air Station Anacostia, just outside of D.C. And this is also where the Life photographer captured that photo of John L. that ends up becoming the cover of Life magazine a couple months before the president awarded him the Medal of Honor for his leadership on Guadalcanal.
Wow, amazing stuff. And it's indicative of that era. The same applies to Brits and the Canadians, is that in 42, you could be a press sensation just for showing a bit of fight back. He didn't even necessarily, not that I'm saying these guys didn't accomplish anything, but the public just needed someone to get behind. Whether you act like some of the commando raids the British are doing don't necessarily succeed as they should do, but they're giving people hope. They're giving people, these are the people that will see us through this. These are the heroes that will see. Look at Doolittle's fame, in this era. So remarkable stuff. Another fine looking gentleman. The sidebar is full of people saying, where did they get their jawlines from? Where did these amazing men with their incredible physiques come from? I mean, they're all extraordinarily amazing.
They really are, and Richard Mangrum's a very special character. He was born in Seattle, Washington, grew up there. I think his dad was a contractor, built houses. Went to high school, graduated, went on to the University of Washington, finished up at Washington, and went on to law school at the UW. So he was going to become a lawyer. Instead, he loved aviation, began flying, joined the Marine Corps Reserves, got his wings in 1929. And instead of a legal career, he chose a military one, went regular Marine Corps, and spent the 30s flying off of every aircraft carrier the Navy had. And by January of 1942, he was given command of VMS B-232. He was actually at Eva Field on Hawaii, on Oahu, on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. He was sitting down at his kitchen table drinking coffee and reading the paper, and a couple of Japanese torpedo bombers went right overhead, and he realized right away what was going on. So he jumped into his car and sped to Eva Field. He was strafed on the way repeatedly, got to Eva to discover that every single Marine aircraft but one had been destroyed already. So it's something to keep in mind. When these guys got to Guadalcanal, Marine aviation was 0-3 against the Japanese. They were wiped out to the last plane practically at Pearl Harbor. They were crushed at Wake Island, although VMF 211 puts up a heroic fight against incredible odds. And when they ran out of airplanes, they turned out as Marine infantry and fought on the beaches against the amphibious landing that eventually forced the surrender of the garrison. So they fought heroically. But again, at Midway, the Marine Corps units get all but wiped out. VMF 221 and Marion Carl's unit loses most of its men. The leadership collapses. VMS B-241 was the dive bomber squadron, and in 3 missions, they lost 3 skippers and about 2/3 of the men and planes. So it is a point where in the war where Marine aviation has not got a good track record, and they arrive at Guadalcanal with leadership that's stable, experienced, and extremely talented with their ability to motivate and inspire their guys. John L. Smith was a very emotional guy. He ran the squadron very informally, much more informally than Richard Mangrum ran his, because he realized his guys were not really Marines yet. They were college kids in uniform. So they called each other by their first names or nicknames. They called their skipper Smitty instead of John L. Smith or Major Smith or Captain Smith. So there was an informality over on that side of the house. But with the dive bombers, Mangrum was this smooth-talking, intellectual lawyer. And he wasn't a rah-rah kind of leader, but he was one who knew exactly the right thing to say at the right moment. I mean, this guy would have been incredible in a courtroom. And ultimately, he survives his tour with 232 and becomes, in the 60s, the vice commandant of the Marine Corps. So he was an incredible leader. He retired as a lieutenant general. So the 3 key leaders in these 2 units are really what made the difference and overcame everything that these guys faced on the ground and in the air, and against the Japanese, who had every advantage except the flying distance that they had to cross in order to get into combat. Okay, so the person in the center is Arthur O'Keefe. He was one of the inexperienced dive bomber pilots with Richard Mangrum. And Art O'Keefe is such a special story. I know his son, Mike. Mike became a naval aviator himself and flew P-3s during the Vietnam era. Art O'Keefe was the son of a World War I war hero from Southern California who became a district attorney in the San Diego area. And he grew up in Coronado and San Diego and was a shutterbug. Actually started his own business and bought a Leica camera prior to the war. I mean, you can imagine how expensive that must have been. He becomes a Marine aviator. He's one of these guys who arrives in VMSB 232 as a replacement pilot in July of 1942. And the first thing that happens is they go out on carrier qualification trials. They've all got to make a certain number of landings and a certain number of takeoffs. I think they were using the USS Hornet as the flight deck. And Art had a mishap and lost his aircraft. It went over the side, and he went into the water on his first attempt at landing on a carrier. So he almost got trapped in the cockpit as the aircraft sank. They were able to fish him out. He was pretty shaken. He went through some additional training and then made the landings without issue after that. This was a young guy who was determined to live up to his family heritage, who was determined to live up to the demands of Colonel, at the time, Major Mangrum. He worshipped Mangrum like everybody else did. Everybody in the squadron just looked up to this man. He was an exceptional human being. And I mean, always poised. So just before they launched in August to go to Guadalcanal, there was a moment where the Long Island spotted a vessel on the horizon that they thought might be Japanese, and they went to action stations. They went to battle stations. And as Art was running to his battle station, he slipped, and I think he fell down some stairs and badly injured his hip to the point where he was taken to sick bay, couldn't stand on it. And Mangrum was told that he just lost a pilot. So they were only going to Guadalcanal with 11 SBDs. Well, the next morning, Art limped up to Mangrum and said, "I can do this. I can fly this." And Mangrum was like, "You can't handle the rudder with this injury. I mean, you come in later. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out." And Art was insistent he didn't want to be left behind. So finally, he convinced his skipper to go up on deck and watch him in the cockpit of an SBD manipulate the rudders. And sure enough, he could do it. It was painful, but he did it. So Art actually arrives with the first batch of pilots and aircraft on August 20th, 1942, and he's already injured. He goes through the next 30 days or so. He gets malaria. He's got dysentery. He suffers horribly through this whole ordeal. And then during the Battle of Bloody Ridge, his tent takes a almost certain direct hit from a 5-inch shell during the naval bombardment. It kills a bunch of guys, including one of the key leaders in the squadron. I don't want to give the story away, so I won't say who. And rescuers find Art buried among the debris, covered in the brains of one of the guys who had been killed. And he's shaken, as you can imagine. He's malarial, so he's got a fever and he's going through the malarial shivers, and he still flies the next day. And he flies for a couple more days until, coming back from a mission, one of his only remaining friends, and probably the oldest one that he had in the Marine Corps, a guy who had been through training with him, gets shot down right in front of him as they're coming back from a mission preparing to land at Guadalcanal. There was no safe haven. There was no, coming back to East Anglia, for example, and landing and basically being in protected airspace. These guys were getting attacked while they were landing, either by marauding Zeros, or they would be shot at from the ground by the Japanese who were at the edge of the runway. And So Yale Kaufman goes down into the water right in front of him, and Art saw him get hit and saw the blood come out of apparently his neck. And he ends up landing his SBD in the middle of a bombing raid, and guys find him sitting on a stump not far from his aircraft, just completely in a state of shock. His, malaria was, he was shivering from malaria, and he ultimately gets evacuated off the island. And the Navy, there was a Navy officer or a doctor in California who wanted to just railroad him out of the service. They had to get a congressman involved to make sure that that didn't happen. And ultimately, Art returns to service, goes to Iwo Jima in a non-flying billet, ends up volunteering to fly missions in essentially what was a Piper Cub observation aircraft, where he's marking targets for the mud marines, and taking pictures. They're dropping grenades out the window. He does this and earns a Distinguished Flying Cross, and goes on to a long career where he basically flew everything the Navy had until he retired in the early 60s. So incredible human being. Just one of these stories that, Art O'Keefe has been overlooked by pretty much everybody who's ever written about the Cactus Air Force. And a lot of times he's called a psychiatric casualty and evacuated because he had a mental breakdown, and that's not what happened. So being able to set the record straight with Art was one of the most meaningful. I'm gonna get choked up. One of the most meaningful things to me for this book.
We get it, and thank you very much. And it's while you're recovering, this era. We said it earlier. It's about individual bravery, leadership, dogged determination. Whereas perhaps later in a campaign, it's about the system. It's about the refinement of the doctrine. It's about the maintenance of all the ships and the aircraft. And there's an organization aspect. And I'm not saying there isn't still bravery and incredible leadership as well later on, but there's a system in support. It's only the individuals and their bravery. The system hasn't really got up to speed yet. So it just makes these stories even more amazing, because it's all dependent on their incredibly young shoulders. So we'll keep on going. It's enthralling.
You're absolutely right about that, Paul. I mean, really, what rested on the shoulders of a very, very small number of men in 1942 is really kind of staggering. There were 44 in these two squadrons. The pilots, the gunners from VMSB 232, and the pilots from VMF 223. And those 44 end up doing enough to stop the reinforcement stream of Japanese troops and supplies to Guadalcanal, and interdicting that effort, that is what gives the Marines the edge at Edson's Ridge. Because if they hadn't gotten, or if they had received all of the supplies and all of the men that were coming in, that plan would have worked. They would have overrun Edson at Bloody Ridge. They would have gotten to the airfield and split the Marine Corps perimeter in two. And at that point, the plan was, Vandegrift had said, okay, if that happens, we're getting in our alligators, the amphibious tracked vehicles, and we're going into the interior of Guadalcanal, and we're going to fight a guerrilla war. And he told the aviators to get your airplanes out if you could. And John L. and Richard Mangrum said, no, we'll go into the jungle with you.
Wow.
And that's how dire the situation was in September. And that's Mangrum right there at the right, shaking hands with a young cadet. After he got back from Guadalcanal, he was assigned to be the commandant of cadets at Corpus Christi. So he helped train the pilots that went on to crush the Japanese in the Solomons and the Central Pacific.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Peter O'Connell as you just came up. Did the sudden arrival of the Marine Air 820 trigger Ichiki's premature and disastrous Alligator Creek attack?
Oh, that is a great question. Gosh, No, I don't
We've
think
got a
it
good
did.
audience here, John. We're not amateurs here. We have the best viewers.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh man, I just have a great time on your show, Paul. Thank you so much. Ichiki was going to attack one way or the other because it was for him all about glory and offense. He thought he and his understrength battalion could push the Marines off. So no, I don't think it precipitated the attack. I think it just was coincidental.
Okay, thank you.
But that's how the Marines. That's how these Marines were inaugurated into Guadalcanal. That was their first night. Wow. They're on the island for less than 6 hours. They wake up and it sounds like they're about to get overrun. So, they spent the rest of the night with their 45s in hand. And the first morning of flight operations, they went after Ichiki's men. The first quartet of Wildcats up executed strafing attacks on some landing barges that were trying to resupply Ichiki's beleaguered troops. And so, yeah, that was the connection there is really quite brilliant. Thank you for that question.
We have this perception of the U.S. Navy pilots on the carriers with the kind of the Coca-Cola vending machines and the kind of the comfortable wardrooms, things like that. And I'm not saying that life on ship wasn't without its hardships, but as you said, to having to sleep with a 45 kind of in your hand because the Japanese are that close, and then go and take off and do the close air support. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about, as you say, the contrast with the 8th Air Force guys who are incredibly brave, but they are going back and can go to the pub on their days off, which is,
yeah.
This isn't something these guys can do. They are, as you said, they're short of everything, almost in rags with not enough to eat. It's extraordinary.
Paul, it's so funny you mentioned the pub because there's a section of the book that is the first press conference that Marion, Dick Mangrum, and John L. participated in once they got home. And it was the start of the Heroes Tour. And the disconnect between the journalists and the veterans, I mean, it's right there on full display. And I wrote that chapter specifically because I've seen that myself over the years as I've been embedded, and I helped train different units over the years with a volunteer OPFOR group I had. And every time I watched journalists who knew nothing about the military, knew nothing about veterans ask questions, it was just cringe. And there's one of these cringe moments in the book where somebody in the audience, I forget which reporter it was, asked the guys, what was the nightlife like on Guadalcanal?
Wow.
Like they're going to bars and partying. I think the answer was, well, we slept if the Japanese let us.
Wow. Yeah. That's very revealing. It's humorous, but it is revealing of the ignorance sometimes of the press. But back. Let's go back with the photos. I'm loving it. So we got a carrier.
Okay, so that's CVE-1. That is the original baby flap top, the escort carrier that was the experiment for all the others that followed, the USS Long Island. And funny thing about the Long Island, it was converted from a merchant ship, right? Like most of the baby escort carriers were. The Long Island had a very unusual catapult arrangement. First off, it was a black powder arrangement. It wasn't a hydraulic catapult, and it fired 45 degrees off the port bow. So it did not go straight over the bow. And because when they first launched the ship and ran it on trials, they realized that the deck was too short. So they extended the deck, I think, about 40 feet in a quickie refit in August of 41. And when they did that, they couldn't move the catapult. So the catapult was actually 40 feet back from the edge of the deck, firing 45 degrees off the port bow. So it was a very odd arrangement that essentially sent everybody who had to use it into a crosswind, and they were very, very concerned with the Marine launch. This was the ship that took the Marine squadrons, John L. and Dick Mangrum's guys, to Guadalcanal. They launched off the Long Island. It was the Long Island's only combat mission, and I think it was the only battle star. Oh, I think it got a battle star for Midway too, because it was operating with the battleships off the West Coast. But anyway, this was the only time it really went into harm's way. And they weren't sure that they would have enough wind over the deck and the catapult to get the SBDs launched with their 500-pound bombs. And they had to take the 500-pound bombs with them because there weren't any stockpiled on Guadalcanal. They had to actually bring their bombs with them. So, and when you talk about, life at sea aboard these carriers, the creature comforts were there for sure, especially with the Essex class later on in the war. This ship, they had some issue with the food that they had delivered to the vessel. They didn't have enough of it, and the guys basically spent 3 weeks at sea eating cauliflower. So more than one guy from 223 and 232 remembered that and said, I never ate cauliflower again for the rest of my life.
Wow, that's just such a great story. So well, we'll keep on moving. People are loving it. Back to you.
Okay, so this is John L. after about 45 days of combat with some of the guys in his squadron. Marion Carl's at the far right, sitting shotgun. Honestly, I wish Larry Lassise was with me. He's the historian of 223. He could tell you who the other gents are. But if you look, the point of the photo is if you look at John L., you can see how gaunt he looks. And I mean, like, look at his eyes. His bags have bags. This is a guy who's being worn down by combat, by the living conditions, by the leadership responsibilities, the onus of losing guys that he'd come to love. And the thing that really struck me about John L. and this photo in particular was his guys, these Marines in name only. They came from all walks of life. I mean, he had guys in the squadron who were Ivy Leaguers. Charles Kendrick came from a very wealthy family in San Francisco. He went to Stanford at age 16, became a linguist, spoke 7 languages, then goes on to Harvard Law, and then decides, okay, war's coming. I want to be a Marine aviator, and goes into the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. Ditto with Scotty McLennan. Scotty McLennan was from a very, very wealthy Chicago family. He grew up with 7 servants in the household. Meanwhile, Ken Fraser, his dad worked at I think a hydroelectric dam, and he had 7 brothers and sisters, and they lived, a precarious blue collar existence in a working class family. You had Ken Chambers, who was from Princeton, Florida, who was his parents were sharecroppers, and you had all of these guys who their families escaped the Dust Bowl. A lot of them came from Oklahoma, the Midwest, Texas. So you had hard scrabble types, you had Ivy Leaguers all thrown into the squadron together. And because John L. ran things, I mean, believe me, he was a strict disciplinarian and he had a temper on him. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't treat them with the same strata of rank that you would in a normal Marine environment. And as a result, they got super close really quickly. I mean, when you're 3 weeks at sea eating cauliflower, you're going to get close with people or you're going to end up killing each other. But they were an exceptionally close, devoted bunch to one another. And when they started dying, John L. took the losses harder and harder and harder, and it affected him for the rest of his life. And by the end of September, he wrote his wife just how sick of it all he was. In fact, after one of the Ivy Leaguers went down, he was clearly heartbroken writing this letter, and it took a toll on him for sure. Now he returns to combat later on in the war in the Philippines, but he never really recovers from this deployment. And his experience coming home in 42 was part of the reason, which is why I started the book the way I did, which was with the Heroes Tour and then going back to what these guys actually experienced. Because America in November of 1942, it was not like the UK. Everybody in the UK knew the stakes. They'd seen the bombers. They'd endured the Blitz. Yeah. That wasn't the case. America was still insulated, and some areas of the coastline had seen the wrecks after U-boat attacks, but the deluge of yellow telegrams from the War Department had not yet started arriving on doorsteps in small town America. And so I think in November of 1942, there was a total of 19,000 casualties, according to Time magazine in 42.
Wow.
So we're talking just a trickle. And it's not until 1943-44 that every single town, every block in the United States is affected by the war, because either somebody's in uniform, somebody's got a Gold Star family living next door, or they are the Gold Star family. And so the disconnect between what they just experienced and, the Washington elite set that they're introduced to at the start of the book is like 2-3 weeks before they're in Washington having this wonderful formal meal. This is what John L. looked like. And he was subsisting off of captured weevily, maggoty rice in the jungle. And the rest of the country didn't really understand that. We were kind of just playing at war. And when you look at the whole image of the greatest generation and the good war, as Studs Terkel wrote about in the 80s, you don't think of us as unserious through it. Like we have been in the war on terror, really. I mean, like you could go to sections of the United States and nobody was affected by that. But in 1942, in November of 1942, the shock of Pearl Harbor was wearing off, and people were playing football. College football was still going on. People are still going to nightclubs. People are still eating at nice restaurants. There's, rationing hasn't really sunk in yet. There's still abundant everything, and this was a huge divide between the returning warriors and the people that they were fighting for. And nobody knew how to bridge it in 1942.
And it was only going to get worse. Think of Peleliu and the combat footage there. And a year later, the US people were going to see it was going to get worse before it was going to get better, unfortunately. But we'll carry on with these photos, because just we're hanging off every word. But there's a few more to go.
So this is Bruce Prosser. He was the operations officer for Richard Mangrum. Bruce was from Oregon, and he ended up living in Salem after the war. Bruce was a veteran of Midway and VMSB 241's attack on the Japanese carriers that was ineffective, and they lost almost half the squadron. He went on to be one of the Midway veterans pulled into Mangrum's unit to give them a cadre of experienced aviators. The problem with that, especially in 232, was the survivors of Midway were very pessimistic. They had just watched what had happened to their unit and their friends, and they really believed that none of them would survive. Danny Iverson was another one from Midway who ends up here with Bruce Prosser. And Iverson was extremely pessimistic. So you had this dichotomy inside 232 where you've got all these young, eager second lieutenants who have no concept of combat. They're talking about all the Japanese ships that are going to sink, yada, yada, yada. And you've got guys like Bruce who'd been through it, who'd flown an unescorted strike against, one of the most heavily defended naval targets on the planet. at the time, and watched his squadron commander go down, and watched half his buddies lost. So that was a huge divide between the within the squadron, and eventually they come together, and it was a couple of the second lieutenants that actually bridged the divide, which I write about in the book. But Bruce goes on and becomes the single most experienced dive bomber pilot in the Marine Corps by the end of the war. He actually flew more combat dives than any other Marine Corps pilot from 42 to 45.
Wow, amazing stuff. We'll keep going. We've got a couple of questions later on, but keep going with the photos. Fantastic stuff.
Okay, so this is right at the end of the deployment. Just shy of, I think, October 10th, may have been October 8th. This is Fred Good's birthday party. Fred was one of the original members of VMF 223. And you can see the guys, they know they're going home soon. They're going to be relieved. There have been more squadrons that have come in. One of the things that they were told just before they left by their senior commander from the air wing, or from MAG 23, was your job on Guadalcanal is to buy time with your lives. Die hard. So essentially they were told just before they left off the Long Island that they were expendable. And Goot and the guys here in this image were the survivors of that mission. They had gotten to the point where they had come up the learning curve. They were all outstanding fighter pilots at this point, and they knew they were going to be relieved because, like I said, the reinforcements had come in. The Cactus Air Force was now an amalgamation of cobbled together U.S. Navy fighter squadrons. Further Marine squadrons had come in, and they were going home. So this was one of the last times that the survivors were all together.
Wow. There we go. Next one.
So this is one of the SBDs from VMSB 232. And what blows my mind about this photo is this is where and how they were maintained. They just were out in the open in a dirt field. They didn't have revetments. They tried that to begin with, but trying to get the aircraft launched quickly became very problematical if they were dispersed around the airfield in the trees and protected. So what they decided to do was set them out in the open as far away from each other as possible so one bomb couldn't destroy more than one aircraft. And that's where they worked on them. That's where they actually loaded the bombs and maintained the engines and the systems on the aircraft. It's quite an incredible story. I mean, if you hear all the time the ground crews are the unsung heroes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really true. And so there are moments where I introduce some of the ground crew. You get glimpses of what they're doing and how they're living. I mean, the first couple of weeks, because their tents hadn't even come in, the ground crews were living under the wings of their SBDs.
I mean, we've just seen Masters of the Air, where the 8th Air Force bases were like, mini, well, not even mini towns. They were like full-size towns with all the amenities on board. And you're there on Guadalcanal in the Solomons with, you said, sleeping under the wings of your aircraft again with, and that photo there gives an indication of just it's no luxury there.
This is one of the only structures the Marines had anything.
Using that term quite loosely, structure. Yeah.
Yeah. They called this the pagoda. It became the operations shack for the two Marine squadrons and actually for the Cactus Air Force. But it sat on a slight hill, and it became apparent by early October that the bombardment forces offshore that the Japanese were sending down at night to try to suppress the airfield and knock it out of commission, that those Japanese gunners were actually using the building as an aiming point. So they bulldozed it. So the one actual structure the Marines had ends up being flattened because it was an aiming point.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so this is one of the SBDs that was destroyed in a bombing raid, I believe. The shocking reality of Guadalcanal was the wastage rate of aircraft. The 223 goes in with 19 F4Fs, and after one encounter with the Japanese, 3 of them are out of commission, and 2 of them were out of commission for over a week. And the same thing happened with Mangrum's squadron. One after another, SBD is either shot down or destroyed on the ground by air attack or naval bombardment. And at one point, the shutterbug, the other shutterbug in Mangrum's squadron, Don McCafferty, walked over to one of, it may actually have been his SBD on fire, I can't remember, but one of them is burning. And of course, he's a shutterbug. He's got his camera out. He's taking pictures of his burning SBD, and it explodes. And it blew him 20, 30 feet backwards. And, I have eternal respect for this because I am a photographer myself. He held onto his camera through all of that, and the film was protected. And it's some of the only photos of 232 that exist are the ones that Don McCafferty took.
Wow, amazing stuff. And then another horrific one to finish the photos, and a couple of questions that we'll give you.
So this is the aftermath of the Battle of Edson's Ridge. This is Bloody Ridge, and why they called it Bloody Ridge. Most of the photos you see of the ridge are cleaned up after they got, disposed of the bodies and buried the Marines. I included this one in the book because it shows the aftermath and the furious nature of the fighting. I mean, it was ferocious is the word I was looking for. Yeah. If you have the stomach to look at this photo, you can see Marines are lying either on top of or under Japanese. This was hand-to-hand combat with no quarter asterisk given for 2 nights in September, and this determined the fate of the Guadalcanal campaign and America's first offensive of the war. And in fact, some of the Japanese were able to break through the Marine Raider lines. They got to General Vandegrift's headquarters, and several of them attacked into the headquarters tent. And there's a whole story about how they were killed. But also about a company minus actually got to the edge of Henderson Field and ended up being stopped by a scratch force of ground crew, Marine ground crew, and Marine engineers. And at one point, one of the naval aviators who was flying with VMSB 232 in what was known as Flight 300, Hal Buell, went to his aircraft the morning after Bloody Ridge and discovered there was a Marine in the cockpit of his aircraft who had machine gunned or Tommy gunned a Japanese soldier off of the wing. And his wing, the wing of his SPD, was covered with blood, and there was a smear on the fuselage. So that's how near run this whole thing was. And that photo really symbolizes the resolution on both sides. I mean, it was all or nothing.
But it's also, because that image is so profoundly harrowing, we maybe have a perception of the Guadalcanal as being the battle on the ground, but you've made it abundantly clear that it's on the ground, it's in the air, it's at sea, as all these campaigns are. It's a multifaceted operation, and to ignore one aspect means you're not getting an accurate picture of the overall campaign, which is, as I say, air, sea, and land. So, we'll do a couple of questions for you, and John. One from Mad Cat. Did these pilots have to develop their own tactics to fight the Japanese? Because is there much of a doctrine they're going in with?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And I write about it. You hear about things like the thatch weave. John S. Thatch invented the way to deal with the Zeros by weaving back and forth to cover each other's tails. John L. did not have time to teach his pilots combat tactics. So he had a month. And so what he decided to do was 2 things. focus on two things with about the 40 hours in the air they were going to get. The first was aerial gunnery. You had to be able to hit whatever you were shooting at. So he drilled them relentlessly, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, flying 2 or 3 missions a day in July while they were still in Hawaii. The other thing was their mission, he knew, was probably going to require them to intercept Japanese bombers. The best way to do that the Navy had developed prior to the war was what was known as the overhead attack, where you would come along and roll down on a target and go as nearly vertical on a bomber. It took incredible skill. It took concentration and the ability to hit something with a high deflection shot. But if you did it right, you were essentially immune from counterfire from the gunners on, right, say, the Japanese Bettys. So that's what he trained them to do. Later on in September, as Navy units started coming into Guadalcanal, the little fragments of squadrons that were orphaned when the carrier decks were damaged or sunk, those guys came in, and there clearly was lots of tactical discussions between them and the Marines, because later on in the campaign, you see 223 and some of the other Marine units using the thatch weave and some of the other tactics that they had learned from the Navy pilots.
Well, that's a great response. And it's also that if you teach the basic skills, then you can kind of build off that. Whereas sometimes if you start with it at too high a level, it's too complicated. In this situation with the Rush, just being able to hit your target, it's a really basic concept, but from that you can build other things. Yeah, it makes sense. So leading off from that question, John, this will be our final one, because we'll leave things. Is, didn't Smith and Mangrum coming back and sharing their experience really help the training of future Marine pilots? Because that's the thing we've been talking about, the fact that later on better doctrines are developed. So they came back on kind of a war bonds publicity thing, but are there essential lessons that were adopted by the U.S. Marine Corps after this?
Oh, absolutely. Both Mangrum, and again, another great question. Thank you. Both Smith and Mangrum were interviewed extensively by the Bureau of Aeronautics to get their lessons learned. And then they went, and most of the guys from the 2 squadrons who had survived, especially the ones who had been wounded, they all end up in training command, teaching the next generation. Mangrum's at Corpus Christi. I can't remember where Smith ends up, but McCaffrey, Danny Iverson, they're all training another generation. Marion Carl takes over 223, and he goes back on a second tour in later on in 43, where he's in the Solomons. And but almost all of these Marines, if they didn't die in training, which a lot of them did, after this Guadalcanal deployment, if you can imagine, like, you survive Guadalcanal, you come back, you get married, you find out your wife's pregnant, and then you get hit in a midair collision with a green as grass cadet. I like that. That's how Danny Iverson dies. Yeah, but they did. They were basically the guys who they had the institutional knowledge of combat for the Marine Corps in late 42. So they definitely played a pivotal role in training the next generation that went out.
Well, Brent, that's a fantastic response. And the overwhelming remarks in the sidebar are, bring John back, bring John back. So I have to think of another reason to bring you back. And I've had a great time talking to you. And it's, we talk about technology, but ultimately, when you're talking about World War II and all wars, it's about people. And sometimes we need to be reminded just how amazing that group of individuals were. As you so brilliantly explained, living on that hellhole, combat, 45s in their hand, not eating enough, not having enough to repair the aircraft, and yet they're holding the line, and they are part of that incredibly pivotal moment they're holding Guadalcanal. So, John, we'll think of another reason to bring you back. I'm happy if you're happy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. I just am so grateful for the opportunity. And to your viewers, I'd just like to say, you're the reason why I have the career that I have. and I cannot thank you enough for that. I had no idea that the things that I would write would resonate as they have, and it just means so much to me. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And you know what to do, folks. If you haven't already, few people have bought the book while they're watching, but go out, order the book. I know we bring a lot of authors, all of whom have got books out, but you've got more space on your shelves, people. just do it. You know, there's no such thing as too many books. Anyone who tells you that is lying. And my other half in the other room is hopefully heard that, because there's no such thing as too many books. Anyway, John, it's been a delight talking to you. We're back with Luke Truxell tomorrow talking about Eisenhower's air plan for Normandy, which will be a fascinating discussion. And then it's lots and lots of Eastern Front Bagration stuff next week. So thanks, everybody. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books, and we'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.